Well, Jeffrey, we're at the point in our culture today where those breadcrumbs you were talking about, there are people actively knocking them out of the way, sweeping them out of the way, thinking that we don't need to see them, we don't need to pay attention to them. But there's another part of fluency that we should talk about. And you started alluding to it when you mentioned Cord Jefferson, who's also nominated for an Oscar for best writing adapted screenplay. And the two of you spoke about being intentional that American fiction not be and I'm quoting, classist dismissing of work that was beneath you, but rather talking about the broadening of representation. And it was this classist dismissing because, if white audiences or the publishing world, in the case of American fiction, if all they respond to is not Monk's mythology book that he wrote, but they're responding to all of the pathology and my pathology. How were you able to be intentional to ensure that by doing that satire in my pathology, you're not you're not dismissing um, the lives of people for whom some of those things are true?
Yes, sure. Absolutely. I think we did a couple of things. One was that we um, we insisted that Monk, and he is in the book as well, be flawed. He's not necessarily the most reliable narrator. He goes through a process of self-reflection. He goes through a process of being checked, particularly by the women in his life. He's not the same man at the end of the movie that he is at the beginning. He's uh, he's considered his flaws. He's considered perhaps some of the blind spots in his perspective. He's considered, uh, his own personal damage, and he's changed. I think that's optimistic. He's changed personally, and he's changed in terms of his understanding that um, perhaps there is space for all of these stories. I think our argument too is we're not saying these stories should not exist, but there's just a broader range of story to be
Right.
told. So that's one way in which we do this. There's also something that interesting that happens in that scene that you describe, in which he, out of outrage, decides to write my pathology. He's writing in this mode that he, is mocking, that he considers dismissive. But at the same time, what he's writing about is a son confronting his father out of frustration, out of disappointment, out of confusion, out of anger. And there's some subtext within that that relates to his own experience with his father having died by his own hand 7 years before the beginning of the film. So even as he's, being disrespectful to this genre of literature, at the same time, he's infused, at least within that scene that we show in the film, something of his own broken interiority, to use his own phrase. And so, um, even in the act of trying to be dismissive, he actually is admitting that there is some value there, at least personally for him. So we hope that, um, we're nuanced in this, and that certainly we're not spouting the gospel ourselves, that there's room for interpretation within our storytelling, um, and there's room for everyone. And I think, again, going back to having a good time with this, we don't take ourselves too seriously. We're kind of, as I said once before to you, we're throwing darts at everyone in the room, including ourselves.
Hmm.
Yeah, that was a very important